The 19th century was a period of monumental change across the world. Europe experienced the global expansion of the British Empire, the rise and fall of Poland, the rise of Napoleon and the fall of the French Empire, the growing power of the Germanic countries, and the domination of Russia in Eastern Europe. In America, there was its westward growth to the Pacific, a catastrophic civil war, and the desperate need for laborers to take on the task of building an expanding country. Across the world, expansion, modernization, and the Industrial Revolution changed the way that people worked, how economies were structured, and where people lived. These are the important elements to our story of the Lipka Tatars who immigrated to the United States, and how they became part of the community in the northeast of America. Welcome to episode 3 of the Lipka Tatar Heritage Series, Coming to America. This 3-part series is a layman's effort to document the background and history of Lipka Tatars from Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus who immigrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. They organized the Lithuanian Tatar Society in 1907 and the Muslim Mosque on Power Street in Brooklyn, New York in 1931. The first video, entitled The Origins of the Lipka Tatars, documents the history of the Tatars from Genghis Khan in the 12th century to the alliance of the Tatars of the Golden Horde with the Grand Duke of Lithuania in early 14th century. The second video, The Arrival of the Lipka Tatars in Lithuania, portrays how these Tatars settled in the Commonwealth of Lithuania and assimilated into Polish-Lithuanian society. This video will describe the dynamics of the 19th century that resulted in the migration of the 500 Lipka Tatars to New York. The records regarding the Lipka Tatars were intentionally destroyed by the Polish and Russians or by unintentional destruction from many years of wars. The regions of Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus from which the Lipka Tatars originate were constantly changing hands and were controlled by many governments. As a result, this video focuses on the key factors that resulted in the migration of Lipkas to the United States. The history of Poland and Lithuania is extremely complicated. In 1386, under an agreement called the Union of Królów, Poland and Lithuania were allied militarily under a single monarch, but maintained their country names, local rulers, and separate governments. This relationship continued for 180 years, but it was not without strife. Poland harbored ambitions to become a European power and often threatened Lithuanian sovereignty. In 1569, the two countries signed an agreement called the Union of Lublin. Although not favorable to Lithuania, the country agreed to this union because Russia was threatening Lithuania from the east. At the same time, Poland threatened Lithuania from the south and west due to its own ambitions for power. Lithuania decided it could not fight wars on two fronts, so they sided with Poland in order to ally themselves against the Russian threat. The Union of Lublin united the two countries to a single state formerly called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This term had been informally used after the Union of Królów, but was formalized under the Union of Lublin. The new treaty stipulated that Poland and Lithuania were states of the Commonwealth and maintained separate armies, treasuries, civil administration, and laws for their individual states. However, within the larger Commonwealth, Poland was more powerful. Lithuania was underrepresented in the government of the Commonwealth because its territories had been so dramatically reduced by Polish annexation in previous years. The Union of Lublin increased Poland's landmass by 3 times and increased its military muscle to satisfy Poland's ambition to be a European power. The new borders stretched east to Russia, southeast to Ukraine, and north to include Estonia. It also created a new social dynamic for the Lipka Tatars residing in Lithuania. Their noble status would continue in the Lithuanian state, but in the larger Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they had no political status. This was the beginning of the Tatars' decline in Europe. The Union of Lublin should have provided greater stability to the Polish and Lithuanian states, but the Commonwealth had trouble governing the new nation. The joint government was burdened with more voices and competing agendas. The Parliament required a 100% vote of passage of new laws, which was impossible to achieve. And importantly, the Commonwealth's new borders were up to 4 times Poland's original size and could not be defended effectively. This resulted in constant border wars with both Russia and Sweden. The new Commonwealth was made up of a broad mixture of ethnicities, cultures, languages, and language dialects. Poland was largely Western Slavic and Catholic, while the Lithuanian and Ukrainian states were Eastern Slavic and observed the Eastern Orthodox religion. The Tatars remained Muslim. Poland's solution to this ethnic mix was to mandate that all states within the Commonwealth follow Polish law, that Polish was to be the national language, and the Jesuits were now entrusted to include Catholicism as part of the education system. This mandate was called Polonization. It explains why the Tatar language fell into decline and why some of the Lipka Tatars who immigrated to the United States spoke Polish. As we'll see later, when Russia conquered this area, the Russian policy of Russification mandated that Russian be the spoken language, which is why Tatar immigrants spoke Russian, or Belarusian, a combination of Polish and Russian. At its peak, Poland was Europe's largest country, but this was short-lived. During its reign, it suffered heavy population and territorial losses in its border wars. Polonization also turned out to be a failed policy. The Commonwealth's disarray did not go unnoticed by powerful neighbors such as Russia and the kingdoms of Prussia and Austria. These 3 countries were all eager to expand their territories, and Poland was ripe for the taking. The history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the 1600s and 1700s is convoluted and outside the scope of this video. But during this time, Poland was constantly at war with Sweden, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, and lost large areas of its territories to its enemies. In the end, Russia, Austria, and Prussia entered 3 successive agreements in 1772, 1793, and 1795, which partitioned Poland between themselves. Poland disappeared entirely from maps of Europe and did not exist as a country from 1795 to 1918. Lithuania experienced a similar fate and did not reappear as an independent country until the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. After Russia established control over the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they began to enforce policies of suppression. Their primary target was those of the Jewish faith. The Russians blocked the Jews into an area which was called the Pale of Settlement that comprised parts of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Moldova, Latvia, and modern-day Belarus. The Pale of Settlement region was further broken down into smaller partitions, and Russia enforced strict border controls, preventing movement between the individual partitions. The Jewish people were allowed to live within their partition, but were prohibited from living anywhere else in the Pale of Settlement, or within the larger Russian Empire. Russia terminated all local laws and established Russian laws as the only laws, and required Russian to be the language taught in school. Although targeted at the Jewish faith, the Pale of Settlement rules affected the Lipka Tatars as well. Lipka families residing across partition borders became separated and could not reunite. In this map, the Lipka Tatars from which we descend lived in a concentrated area located in the Grodno, Wilno, and Minsk partitions of settlement. In a span of 23 years, Lipkas were no longer a centrally located and administered people. They became ethnic orphans with new national identities and officially recognized as Tatars of the Soviet Socialist Republics, Tatars of Belarus, Tatars of Poland, and Tatars of Lithuania, depending on where they lived. As the Lipkas were split across in petitions, they became small minorities within each petition and endured mandated changes to their national loyalty, language, civil rights, and societal norms. These were factors which contributed to their willingness to leave their ancestral homes. History defines the Industrial Revolution as having started about 1760. At this time, society began its evolution from an agrarian and artisan economy to one of machine manufacturing and industry. However, it wasn't until about 1840 that the Industrial Revolution began to change the dynamics of geopolitical economics and power. This had two important effects on the migration of our Lipka Tatar ancestors to the United States. The first was the impact that the Industrial Revolution had on Tsarist Russia. The second was the demand for labor that westward expansion and the Industrial Revolution created in America. Since the time of the Tsars, Russia's political power was passed down through heredity within an aristocratic class of wealthy estate owners. In the 1800s, Russia was an agrarian country dominated by noblemen and aristocrats. This left 97% of the population of Russia in the peasant class, who were poor and had no vote in the governance of the country. The wealthy agrarian landowning aristocrats did not want to give up their power and resisted the change to an industrial society. As a result, Russia was late to the Industrial Revolution. After its defeat in the Crimean War in the 1850s due to its manufacturing weakness, Tsar Alexander II declared an end to serfdom in 1861 and released the peasants from their obligations to the agrarian aristocracy. This prompted a flight of people from the farms to work in the Russian factories located in major cities. As the farmers left the rural areas, it created a labor shortage on the farms, resulting in a reduction of food production and famine throughout Russia. Meanwhile, population in the cities grew exponentially, creating a greater demand of food in the cities. Unrest grew amongst the poor classes due to frustration with royal domination, hunger, and overpopulation in the cities. When Alexander II ended serfdom and began Russia's transition to an industrial economy, he also opened Russia's western borders and welcomed investors and skilled laborers into Russia. Many people from Western Europe migrated into Russia for this opportunity. Between 1860 and 1917, over 4.5 million people entered into Russia. The downside of this policy was that it left Russia with a surplus of native, unskilled laborers, resulting in high unemployment in the poorer classes. To resolve this, the emperor decreed that Russia's poor, unskilled workers were allowed to leave the country. Many people living in the Pale of Settlement who suffered under Russian domination decided to seek new lives elsewhere. While these people emigrated to new homes throughout the world, our Lipka Tatar ancestors were those who chose to migrate to America. Russia eventually imploded with the Russian Revolution of 1917. The revolution removed the Tsars and aristocracy from power and created a new government. The rise of the USSR is outside the scope of this video, but would impact Lipkas who stayed in their ancestral homes. The second effect of the Industrial Revolution on the migration of the Lipka Tatars to New York was an insatiable need for workers in America during the late 1800s. By 1850, the U.S. stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and opportunities were plentiful for those courageous and strong enough to endure the hardships of pioneering new lands. The U.S. government was anxious to fill these states with cities, ranches, and farms in order to settle the territories and add them into the national economy. A wagon train could take up to 6 months to cross the country, so railroads, one of the Industrial Revolution's greatest developments, became the answer to moving people and goods to the new states. Immigrants could disembark in the eastern U.S. and quickly be distributed westward. These immigrants would build new cities, dams, start farms, mine natural resources, and build more railroads into the endless supply of land. Meanwhile, in the cities of the East, industrial growth was transforming American society. It produced a class of wealthy industrialists and a prosperous middle class. It also produced a large blue-collar working class. It was this labor force, made up of millions of newly arrived immigrants from all over the world, that made American industrialization possible. Immigrants came to the U.S. for many reasons. They might flee their countries due to famine, unemployment, poverty, high taxes, or religious and ethnic persecution. Many immigrated because the U.S. was perceived as a land of opportunity with streets paved in gold. In fact, this perception was promoted by the U.S. itself. Sales agents for the U.S. and the steamship companies were located throughout Europe with the goal of enticing workers to come to the U.S. Posters were hung throughout Europe with appealing pictures of towering skyscrapers, gleaming factories, and a healthy workforce. It was a full-scale marketing effort to encourage immigration, and it worked. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly 12 million immigrants arrived in the United States from all over the world until immigration was eventually curtailed by the U.S. government at the start of World War I. The peak year was 1907, when 1.7 million immigrants arrived in America. Records indicate that over 400,000 people from Russia and Russian territories emigrated to the United States during these years. So our Lipka Tatars made up only a tiny fraction of those immigrants. We don't have a record, written or oral, of why our Lipka Tatar ancestors decided to leave their ancestral homes. We must infer from general history that our forefathers, who were inhabitants of the Pale settlement, came to the country to escape poverty, Russian domination, persecution, and for the opportunities that America offered. The 500 Lipka Tatars that settled in New York and started the Lithuanian Tatar Society in 1907 began to immigrate to the United States in the 1890s. Scholars believe the first Lithuanian Tatars immigrated to the United States in 1894. We don't have exact dates for each of the families, but I know that my maternal grandfather, Bakir Rafalovich, immigrated in the mid-1890s from Evier in current Belarus. His wife Ruza immigrated a few years later in 1898. Only a few families immigrated from 1894 through 1901, but between 1902 and 1915, the majority of the 500 Lipka Tatars immigrated to the United States and settled in the New York City area. The paternal grandparents of the producer of these videos, Brad Barker, immigrated in 1905, also from Evier. The dramatic drop that we see in Tatar immigration in 1915 was due to World War I. The U.S. government stopped all immigration during the war for fear that immigrants were agents of foreign enemies. For multiple reasons, Tatar immigration never achieved its previous levels after World War I. We assume that the 500 Tatars entered the U.S. through Ellis Island, as 99% of all immigrants who entered the country on the East Coast came through Ellis Island after 1892. Like my grandparents, it was not unusual for the husband to arrive first. The wives and family would follow once the husband found a job and a home. Of the 500 Lipka families, most emigrated from Tatar settlements in the central area of current Belarus, such as Evier, Novodurak, and Mir. According to available records, Evier was the leading town of origin. This connection to Evier would come into play decades later when the members of the Muslim mosque would send money to Evier to help rebuild the mosque that had been destroyed there. When they first arrived, new immigrants typically lived with a family member or family friend. They may stay with these families until they settled in their new life. Eventually, as wives and children arrived, they would find their own apartment, but often share it with one or two other families. As they became more prosperous, they would find their own home or move beyond New York City. As the decades passed, Lipka Tatar families would move from New York City to Worcester, Massachusetts, Uncasville, Connecticut, and areas of New Jersey. The most frequent surnames among the Lipka Tatar immigrants were Shabanovich, Rafalovich, Radkevich, Gambitsky, Alexandrovich, Safarevich, and Strutsky. Contrary to common belief, names were not changed by immigration agents at Ellis Island. However, the same name may be spelled or pronounced differently based on the immigrant's country of origin and their spoken language or dialect. For example, Shabanovich was spelled many ways. The pronunciations would differ, such as Shabanowitz, Shabnowitz, or Shabanovitz. People with similar names may not be genetically related to each other, but shared a surname due to the way the names were derived in their country. Names were also changed by the immigrants themselves once they arrived in the United States. They did this to sound more American and to disassociate themselves from their origins in Russia. My grandfather, Bekir Mustafa Rafalovich, changed his name to John Raffel. Alexandrovich may be changed to Alexander, or Chalecki changed to Koletsky. Sometimes more significant changes occurred, such as changing Chesvievich or Chesnowitz to Chester, or Shabanovitz to Barker. The early immigrants found employment in traditional Tatar trades, particularly leatherworking and fur processing. As described in an earlier video, Tatars were experts in animal husbandry, animal care, and in trades involving animal skins. These were welcome skills in the garment industry in New York City, and Tatars quickly found employment in the furrier businesses. It is probable these ancient skills were a reason that Tatar workers were encouraged by the fur businesses to sponsor new Tatar immigrants to New York. Several of our Tatar family members were elevated to high positions in the furrier trade unions, which helped to bring new immigrants into the industry. Eventually, continued immigration created a strong Lipka Tatar community in the New York City area. By 1907, a sufficient number of Lipka Tatars lived in New York to organize themselves into a formal community, and the Lithuanian Tatar Society was formed. This society is recognized as the first official Muslim organization in the United States. Although its name changed many times over the years, this society continues to exist today through the mosque at 104 and 106 Power Street in Brooklyn, New York, and is the longest continually operating Islamic society in this country. The initial charter of the society was, quote, to unite the Mohammedans in America on economic grounds, to provide material assistance in case of illness, injury, loss of ability to work, unquote. In 1911, an official charter was written which documented the governing laws of this group. This community continued to grow in size through 1915, when immigration laws restricted new immigrants. It is this group, those that immigrated to the U.S. from the 1890s through 1915, that we refer to as the 500 Lipka Tatars who created the Lithuanian Tatar Society, and later the Muslim Mosque in Brooklyn. We say that it was 500 people, but this is reflected in the membership roster of the society. Only adult men were officially members of this group. Wives and children were included in the husband's membership with the same rights and benefits. As a result, true membership in the Lipka community was a greater number of people than 500. Wives could become independent members if they were widowed or divorced. Male children could join once they became adults or married. In the beginning, the society met in rented facilities or members' homes. In 1927, a committee was formed to begin looking for a permanent mosque for the society. In 1931, the Muslim Mosque on Power Street was opened. This is a remarkable accomplishment, given that the United States was in the midst of the Great Depression, which lasted from 1928 through 1939. Today, this mosque is recognized as the oldest continually operating mosque in the country and continues to welcome believers today. For over 50 years, the Muslim mosque in Brooklyn was a thriving community of Lipka Tatars of Islamic faith. An imam was in residence. Daily prayers and special services were held. Religious training was provided to children, and social activities were frequent. Young Lipka Tatars married other Lipkas, or sometimes Muslims from other ethnic groups. The common homeland, religion, and culture resulted in close ties between the people of the Lipka community. Many of us today have wonderful memories of dances, picnics, beach days, and weddings with our Lipka families and friends. Where are the Tatars of today? History shows their presence across all corners of Eastern Europe and Asia, as evidenced by the remaining abundance of artifacts and mosques. In Europe, there's a limited Lipka population. However, their historic presence is real. For example, there is a popular Russian saying, "Scratch a Russian, and you will find a Tatar." And in Vienna, visiting Lipka Tatars wear sprigs of hay in their hat as recognition of their role in the Battle of Vienna. During the 1500s, there were as many as 200,000 Tatars living in the PLB. Recent census data puts the Tatar population in the PLB at approximately 12,000 people. Our review found there was intentional government effort to diminish the presence of Tatar and other ethnicities built into the policies of Russification and Polonization. It was later continued through treaties that created new borders, the destruction resulting from 2 world wars, and the reestablishment of nations and new constitutions after the fall of the USSR. In each change, government leaders set nationalist priorities at the expense of ethnic and religious minorities. In our Lipka American experience, this was perhaps the primary reason for our ancestors to disassociate themselves with their past and leave their homes. While our families here in the U.S. rejoiced in large ethnic gatherings, they kept a low profile on their culture and religion when they moved outside the New York area. In public school, we participated in mandatory and awkward Christian prayers in order to fit in within our communities. Because Russia remained the enemy of the U.S. through the 2 world wars and other conflicts, Tatars in the U.S. changed their surname to engage in private business in order to avoid any stigma associated with their Russian history. In a personal example, in the late 1960s, I was invited to interview for a U.S. government security position after completion of my military service. After a seemingly successful and lengthy interview, I was asked if I had relatives living in Iron Curtain countries, to which I openly responded, yes. All materials were promptly taken back, and the interview was terminated with no further interest. Since the 1990s, Tatar history has emerged from published fields of study, particularly in Europe. The governments of Poland and Lithuania are promoting and subsidizing minority ethnic heritage projects. The Internet provides access to a limited amount of internationally produced academic Lipka Tatar research, and major universities in the U.S. recognize ethnic diversity and are offering courses of study on the topic. I encourage interested parties to reach out to explore our history. Lipka Tatar history in the United States is more than 120 years old. My wish is that you recognize that although we are a single facet in the diamond of world cultures, our Lipka ancestors contributed to the establishment of the Western world that we live in today.